Chief Architect and Founder at Archidentity. And we are joined by Will Plowman, who's the Partner and General Manager at Foster and Partners, as well as Charles Walker, the Director of Zaha Hadid Architects. We would also like to thank the Mohammed bin Rashid Centre for Government Innovation, as well as the Sheikh Zayed Housing Programme and Buildner Architecture Competitions for being partners in this second edition, and especially for Mohammed bin Rashid Centre for Government Innovation to have arranged for this second edition panel discussion. As you may well know, the second edition of the House of the Future competition pays tribute to the same legacy that was left by the first edition, which is to create an Emirati house that deals with identity as well as functionality and even more prevalent issues such as climate response is the main themes of the second edition. And we also would like to highlight that we are joined by a group of jury panels that are global in scale. So we have Calatrava architects. We have representatives from the Dubai Road and Transport Authority and Barkangels Group, BIG, as well as Studio CLearn, as well as MVRDV, and of course, the jury members that are with us in this session. So I hope that this will be a thought-provoking and a very clear identification of what the entries should be consisting of. And we'll be basically delving into very specific questions about how to address climate change. And it will also be focused on the topic of tech-driven climate response architecture, which is allowing designs of homes to adapt and thrive in a changing environment. In addition to that, we'll also be talking about how advanced technology and innovation can enhance resilience to extreme weathers, such as our local climate here, and the rising sea levels and unpredictable climates. Not to take long in this introduction, we will jump directly into the questions. We have participants and people wanting to know more about these topics. So we will be starting out with the first question, which of course I'll throw out to yourself, Will, and Charles, about how advanced technologies like building information modeling, BIM, and computational design, how can it enhance climate resilience in building design? So I'll throw that question out as a warm-up, and we'll get more into the detail as we go through them. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I think within Foster's, BIM is absolutely integral to how we work, and I think as we're moving, with changing climate, with resilience, this able to predict and to be able to build three-dimensionally and share modeling with engineers, with all parties, with even local authorities, RTA, to understand what is happening and to almost an early warning to what's happening. We can also model for 10 years time, predicting what the weather is and how that information feeds in. So if we know the temperature in August is going to be very hot, 6 months beforehand we can adapt the building. This is a very important part of it. I think some of the proposals in last year's submission really addressed that and looked at how to improve shading, position of building, and all with the three-dimensional modeling. I think that's really a key part of how we can use that.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yes, go ahead, Charles.
Well, I was going to say I fully agree with that, Will, and I guess the other part of it is that with a comprehensive 3D model, you can actually prepare simulations, like not only solar light modeling and heat gain, but you can look at mechanical performative, like overall thermal transmission values, um, even computational fluid dynamics, air movement in space. So with the 3D model, there's a lot more opportunity to do a greater number of simulations to understand like the performative quality of the building, you know, both in terms of heat and energy use.
So specifically looking at the region, just to build more of the first point, I think, Will, you mentioned about how a building can adapt. So let's say, for example, 6 months early on, we noticed that the temperature is going to become much more um, uh, challenging in terms of the heat gain. So, when you mentioned that a building can be adapted to that early on, can you just share maybe an idea where you have about this specific topic? So, let's say, for example, we predict that. Is there any examples that you can share about this specifically? Or if Charles, maybe you do have some examples yourself?
I think one building which is not necessarily a residential, but is the Apple store in Dubai Mall, which is actually a moving predictive. So as the heat comes in the day, because actually that's also something very important is our connectivity with the outside. We don't want to feel in a space that's too dark because it's always shaded, but as the sun tracks, or as we can use shading to help that. So I think this dynamic facade is also a very interesting kind of next level as we start to predict temperature changes, how the facade can actually move to do that. That could be one way of addressing it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we'll move on to the other question. What role can renewable energy systems such as solar and wind power play in reducing the carbon footprint of buildings during extended periods of climate instability?
Yeah, I think one of the things we're looking more and more at is how to be off grid, and I think the UAE government's really embracing this and the plug and play. So where we need energy from the grid, we can use it, and where we're not using it, we can feed back in. So the use of PVs to power your own energy, using water within your own system, grey water, and more that becomes sort of integral to all the housing as we move forward. So that this off-grid nature is really important. I mean, we see it in projects in the desert where, you know, maybe it's a farmhouse where there isn't connectivity to the main grid. That becomes so important, and I think that will come more and more into the urban environment as well. So how we can disconnect as well. So I think this is where I think it's really important for us to take note in these, especially these residential housing.
Particularly relevant in Dubai as well, where, you know, I think the DEWA headquarters, the Dubai Electrical Water Authority, are building a zero energy building. So the PV array on the roof will generate enough power to power the entire building. And I don't know if you know this. There's a book from this kind of American panelist, Jeremy Rifkin. He writes in the Third Industrial Revolution that essentially in future he foresees like a energy network, which rather than being a kind of 19th century paradigm of centralization and then an array of electric power cables outwards, that the future paradigm is a grid, a little bit more like the internet, like an energy grid where everyone is supplying into the grid and taking out of the grid, selling power back into the grid at peak hours, and then storing power in batteries, either in their house or in their car. So he's sort of foreseeing a future where every building would be a zero energy building, which would both supply energy into the grid and extract from, still connected to the grid, but supplying to and extracting from. And it's quite, I mean, the opportunity with PVs in Dubai is quite fantastic. You know, the amount of energy that's harvested there is much higher than Northern Europe with PVs, and I know that DEWA are kind of championing the way in that regard. So I think the idea of integrating PVs in the project is it's pretty it's a pretty clear way forward in the region. Yeah.
Yes, I think one of the main issues that from because our there is a certain amount of dust in
Yes.
our climate. So sometimes the PVs, although they are abundant, sometimes there are some challenges in terms of efficiencies due to
Yes.
the dust collection on those. So some
Yeah.
of the solutions to address those were very challenging because you have this kind of self-watering systems and irrigating systems. So it has been proven sometimes to be a challenge in terms of cost. So um, just to build on those, what my point being is that we have always these strong paradigms between where we want to go and where we are. So they kind of have this contrast. So currently on a grassroots level, I see in individual villas of Emiratis, we mostly have our hot water is a combination of the heating is from these solar panels, and we also have to have a chiller system to counteract that. So I mean, what advice either Will or Charles do you have, and what suggestion would you give us to taking that maybe one step forward so we can address those on a grassroots level? So, for example, if somebody were to be proposing a solution which is practical and adaptable, what ideas would come to your mind based on this topic if you were to deal with a single Emirati home where the client obviously has got a certain budget allowance, but at some level it is restricted.
Yeah, I think it's a challenging question. I think one of the things is where you position the tanks, because obviously in the summer the tanks get super hot, so then you've got to then put more energy to cool that. So I think by hiding the tanks below ground in almost like a well system could be a way to address that, where you could collect the water to actually use the earth to cool the water, and therefore you're having less energy and that's a very low cost kind of adaptive process. But yeah, I think it's a challenging one because, as you said, we need to cool the buildings. It's how to reduce that energy that we need to cool them. So.
Mm. I
Thank you.
mean,
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things is, using, like, I guess, really intelligent engineering systems. One of the things we've looked at is, for example, you talked about the dust on the PVs. One of the things we've looked at is bonding PVs to a glass fiber reinforced concrete panel, which has a capillary mat in. The problem with dust is that in the morning you get condensation on the panels, and then the dust collects, and as the condensation
Yeah,
dries it gets baked
yes.
on. So if you circulate water through the cementatious panels during the day to cool them, that actually increases the performance of the PVs. That warms up the water. And if you circulate the warm water through the panels at night, you don't get condensation, and so then you don't get the dust baking on the PVs. So it's kind of, they're very subtle kind of engineering methodologies, but I think you need a really good climate engineer, a really good mechanical engineer um, to work with you. And then, I think eventually some of these kind of techniques and methods will work their way into the industry and become more common use.
No, thank you so much. Very insightful. Very insightful. What innovative materials and construction techniques can improve building resilience to extreme weather events? So nowadays, as you both know, we hear a lot about 3D printing and so forth, and we just would like to know through both of your experiences if there are really applicable materials that can give the reassurance of durability and sustainability in terms of those materials and things that maybe you have seen in your portfolio of projects all around the world. What are things that stand out for you that can improve our building resilience to extreme weather events?
Yeah, I think this is a kind of an ever debated topic because there's obviously the price kind of against and durability, and I think obviously the seismic zone have been where we are here. I think two interesting things which I think will find their way more and more is cross-laminated timber. In Europe, it is kind of the go-to material, and I think there's more and more studies about how to stop that damage from condensation or movement within the climate here. And there's another kind of two probably other ones are interesting is the self-healing concrete. So the concrete, if it is damaged or is cracking, can self-heal. So this is something that's really taking shape. And then we've done some experiments with 3D printing steel, which is really interesting. So that can then make the building much, I guess, lighter, because you're not having waste steel, because the printing of the steel can be very accurate, and you don't need to have redundancy in that. So I think those kind of three materials are working their way into kind of universities now and being tested. And I think the next step is how do we use them in the kind of day-to-day and make that really efficient.
Yeah, maybe just to add, well, like all of the research that's gone into making more sustainable concrete mixes as well, reducing the embodied energy in the concrete. So, it's becoming, I remember, in previous years, there were a lot of people looking at rammed earth as a low energy solution, which is interesting, but you can almost imagine a future where rammed earth and low energy concrete kind of almost combine as a material. And we could be using concrete in a much, much more sustainable way, which would also allow you to use it in a slightly more robust way.
No, very interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
So partly I feel the issue with, especially here with when it's very windy, is the concrete dust. So being able to use a more liquefied and managing that on sites, and also making the buildings lighter they're sitting on. So if the buildings, one of the very interesting things we talked about was, let's say, removing block work in partition walls and using timber or lightweight material. This then reduces the load of the building, reduces the amount of concrete that you need to use. And as Charles said, mixing that with rammed earth or other materials, so you can combine these together to. I think this is very interesting how it's moving.
I mean, timber, of course, is the best because it actually sequesters sequesters carbon rather than releasing carbon into the environment. So you can get to a zero carbon building by using materials that are carbon producing, but then other materials that are carbon sequestering. But I know there are reservations about the use of timber in the region because of the dry climate and I think that's obviously quite right, and that's current experience. But again, I would say as the industry develops, the techniques of managing and detailing timber so that it's not exposed to the elements, and almost like the way we avoid thermal bridges and make sure that the timber is always enclosed in a conditioned environment. I think there could be ways of detailing timber that could be, and also selection of timber species in particular, that are more durable and able to deal with dry climates. That could increasingly open the opportunity for the use of timber or less aversion to it in the region. But again, it takes time. The industry needs to develop, and the techniques and details that would allow or facilitate the kind of safe and durable detailing of timber also needs to be developed, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, you're both right to mention that. I mean, specifically you, Charles, that timber always in the Middle East, because of our 90% humidity average, it really affects the wood significantly. And I know that these things have been addressed in the past, and now there are more resilient materials. But I think still there's a lot of challenges into adding that into again, as a grassroots level in local housing. But I'm sure, as you mentioned, when we get to that level where we really have to look at our carbon footprint, and we on a fundamental level, I think that's very important to consider. But very thoughtful interventions in terms of the steel, and the concrete as well, the self-healing concrete, because These materials are obviously used on a daily basis in every single construction site. And I think introducing those levels of innovations can be very um, insightful and also cost effective. So, as you know, in the end, there's always the material component, and then there is the labor component, which is to have the experience to adapt to these new ways of constructing or assembling. So it's always good to, work within this kind of a comfort zone where these materials are innovative, yet the you can say the local market can easily absorb it and apply it. So I think I'm very interested myself. I come from a background of studying in the States, so I love the timber construction, and I would love to see it being adapted to some local buildings over here. But I think the appetite is always for innovations to concrete and steel for the time being. So thank you very much for those insightful comments. We'll move on to IoT. So we'll talk about how can smart building technologies such as sensors and IoT devices enhance building performance and occupant comfort now that everything is linked together, every single TV set is linked to the internet. Why can't such ideas be adapted to air conditioning systems, for example? Maybe you do have actual examples of those where, you don't necessarily have to overuse the air conditioning system on a very cooled, in an abnormally cooled environment, which uses a lot of energy. So, what interventions or what advice can you give us in terms of using the air conditioning systems more wisely? First of all, in terms of reducing the cost of running these buildings, but at the same time, more and more importantly, how does IoT devices and how does smart building technologies play a vital role in that?
Yeah, I think really to start with the passive design first, and then that instantly takes a kind of hit off the any of the kind of additional mechanical elements you need. So orientation, thermal mass, passive cooling. Start with that as the kind of almost the number one thing, and then within that you could start to look at low E glass, thermochromatic glass, and responsive shading. I think these three elements can then what you want to do is let the sun and light in, but reduce the heat gain, which is obviously can be very extreme here. But yeah, I think those are the kind of key parts I would say, and then that monitoring of that energy can then feed back into the facade, as we talked about on one of the earlier questions, which is, can the facade be adaptive? And it's learning all the time, and I think that's where AI can come in. It can predict and say that maybe there's only 10 of the staff in the office today, so we can reduce that kind of linking in, or if a family's got a big family meal within the house, then let's increase the cooling at that time. That kind of link with personal diaries or something can be very interesting.
It's interesting that
Charles, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say, in the old days, in a traditional house, you'd have sort of one thermostat that would, control heating and cooling, generally located in the center of the house. But now, with IoT and these new kind of, Wi-Fi driven kind of controls, you have a thermostat in every room, which gives you have more monitoring, which is interesting to see heat and humidity variation by room, but you also have more control. You can set up timers. You can have lights going on automatically, going off automatically, routinely to save energy. And then, obviously, if anyone's in the room, they turn them back on. Motion sensors are also becoming, increasingly common. There's a number of systems, like for residential use, on the market that are competing to capture some of this kind of emerging market. It's quite interesting because you don't really have to heat your entire house. You only have to heat, say, I'm thinking of the UK example. you only have to heat, say, the 1 or 2 rooms that you use during the weekday, and the rest of the house you can leave reasonably cool, and then heat up other rooms during the weekend, and so on. Or heat the den only in the evening. Or I mean, I suppose it'd be the reverse in UAE. You'd cool the den only in the evening, all set up on timers. So it's quite an interesting new world, but there's a lot of tech, and it's quite complicated. And there's it's usually on a residential scale, it ends up being the homeowner who kind of has to set it up and configure it on their Wi-Fi and phone. But there's a lot of early adopters and new systems on the market. It's quite an interesting new field that's developing.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. So, what strategies can architects use to design buildings that thrive in these extreme climates, such as an extreme desert environment? So, I think in this one, we need to focus a bit more on the specificity of the region. So, let's say, for example, we take all these design points that we mentioned earlier. So, if you're dealing now with extreme desert climate, so what are the basic strategies that you use when you design to thrive in these kind of climates, other than obviously looking at the shading techniques? Are there other points that you think can be more relevant to thrive in these kind of harsh environments?
Well, I think Will, you sort of hit on it earlier about passive systems. That's really the key, isn't it? Learning from traditional methods and techniques that have been used for in some senses developed without the benefit of even architecture or engineering or scientific analysis, but like say just the use of thermal mass to moderate like the diurnal temperature fluctuation, absorbing heat in the day. Of course, some of those techniques no longer apply because as we have heavily insulated buildings, you no longer need thermal mass to the same degree you did before. But I think learning from passive systems and techniques like the wind towers that have been used to ventilate. Um, this is and in particular, yeah, building orientation in relation to sun, um, the control and not overuse of glass. Um, these are kind of all lessons from the past that I think are still quite relevant and quite important for designers today.
Yeah, I think
100%.
I think the only one that maybe Charles mentioned earlier, which was the amount of condensation we have here. I think trying to capture that and use that for evaporative cooling. I think in the Atacama Desert in Chile, for example, they collect the water using very simple plastic sheets and then reuse that within the housing. These, just to try and integrate some of this, nature that's already there and help that to cool you down, as well as the passive elements we talked about.
Mm.
Yes.
I've
I
actually
myself,
seen,
yeah. Go ahead, Charles.
just out of curiosity, I've seen in India, in one of the Maharaja's palace from 17th century, the use of kind of like dripping water down reed mats to generate evaporative cooling in window openings. So kind of pretty interesting the amount of engineering that our ancestors were able to develop without the use of scientific techniques. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So me myself, I'm kind of a flag bearer for using these traditional kind of elements. But whenever comes down to actually convincing the designers or the consultants or the contractors, we always kind of reach a dead end because we say, for example, I want a functioning wind tower in a contemporary house design. But we always, in the end up abandoning that idea, or most of the time. So why do you think that is, if you were to put it in a local context, because you both have local experience in practicing within the Emirates. So, are there any advice you can give to how we can pave the way for more innovative ideas such as these? Or do you think that there has to be more of a framework plan that needs to be introduced to incentivize the use of these technologies that are kind of prevalent in the past?
I think just from experience within the UK market, the fireplace has become such a focal point. And I think if it's very well designed, it has a dual function. One is an aesthetic. If it's beautifully designed, then it's difficult to remove because people feel that this is adding a visual value to it as well. So if you see in the top houses in the UK, they do have these stunning fireplaces. It's how to bring that cooling in, and it's actually a privilege to have this, and it's a centerpiece within the living room or in the majlis, that as a talking point, and you can feel that cool air coming through or hot air leaving the room. This could be a way of doing it, or giving it something else, dual function, so that it's we talked about the water reuse, maybe the curtains having a double use, that water is feeding the plants or something in a biophilic way. Then the double meaning always can have a strong way of arguing your point.
It's a really good point, Will, about the fireplace. It's like in London, houses with original features attract a higher price on the market, because those original features are quite sought after. I mean, Ahmed, I think one of the problems that we face with these issues is that it's always easier to solve a problem with a high energy solution. You know what I mean? Because energy is, in general, or at least over the last 30 to 50 years, it's been abundant and relatively cheap. And in fact, there's some critics who've reframed the history of modern architecture as a inherently high energy architecture. That the modern buildings have they have a very, very high embodied energy to create them, and they have a very, very high energy use in operation. And in some senses, modernity, or the palette of materials that we've come to know as the modern materials, they were conditioned by the fact that they emerged in a very, very cheap energy period of history. So now, I guess the idea of, of recognizing issues of climate change and so forth, and the need to reduce energy use and energy consumption on an individual basis. But I think it's still, in real terms in the market, it relies on the passion of the individual to pursue these solutions and to produce an exemplary house. Because on balance, it's always going to be easier to revert to a high energy solution to a problem.
Thank you so much. Thanks. So now, if you allow me, I'm going to expand the scale slightly. So taking it from a housing level more now onto an urban planning level. So I'm just going to ask a little bit about what are some of the best practices for integrating climate resilience into urban planning and into general master planning developments, if there are any differentiation between the two, and if you have any experience in terms of, let's say, for example, there's a person that is submitting for the competition, and we had this last year, the last edition as well, where there wasn't a single individual villa. It was a complex of villas that were modules that kind of change and so forth. So do you have any lessons that you can share with us in that sense?
I think some of the schemes last year that worked really well is the buildings that were kind of talking to each other. So it wasn't just a cookie cut of the same module placed next to each other, but it actually created a community, and maybe have different mixes of buildings within which is very typical, and that's adapted to maybe bigger families or elderly families, and how do they work? I think we are designing for people, and different people have different needs. I think one of the things when we had the first call, I think with Charles, was making sure the plans work very well, and I think that is on not just in an individual building, but in the community. How the plan works is how we get into the community, or how does the community address its adjacencies. I think that's very important. And then more and more, I think designing for different ages as well, so young children or very elderly, and that they have different needs, or people of determination. This should all be considered within an urban scale. I think that's those are kind of some of the findings we had from last year.
Absolutely. I'm also thinking a little bit about green space. Well, like sort of, that in the urban context, that there's a bit of integration of, the kind of, flora and fauna within the city, or that the city doesn't just become a hard concrete surface, but that there's an appropriate amount of green space and biodiversity actually integrated within the community. It's always beautiful, like when on a cool morning, when you open your windows and you hear the bird song, that it's kind of a pleasant kind of context within which to live, not only within the individual home itself, but within the broader community space.
No, definitely. I think we're kind of blessed here as well, because it is a migration path. So if you see on Al Qudra Lakes, it's incredible, some of the species that you wouldn't find in most of the world. So to be able to increase that biodiversity, and obviously the birds bring insects, and there's a whole interesting level to how we live, and that connection with nature is super important. I think if you just see the value of buildings next to parks in Europe, how that is now changing in the UAE, and the importance of greenifying the city is really coming through now.
Absolutely. But I would really advocate the idea of, because of the issue of maintenance, and I would really advocate the use of very, very carefully planned and controlled landscapes that are designed for biodiversity, not like excessive use of, grass or some other kind of monoculture, which actually isn't really that conducive to biodiversity, because there's only one. You might even be using insecticides or some kind of weed, control. But the idea of much more, maybe even smaller, but carefully planned green spaces that actually, where the plant selection and the landscaping is actually developed to encourage biodiversity, rather than like broad sweeping areas of grass, which look fine, but they're not actually that well suited to the climate, and they don't really give that much opportunity for biodiversity, because it's a monoculture.
Yeah, I mean, we currently have a local trend now in Dubai, and local housing, where there's always a challenge, because Will was originally talking about how to create a passive design. Through our experience, a typical courtyard typology, whichever way or form, whether it's a C shape or a U shape or a H shape or so forth, you always end up with a beautiful balance between open space and built space. And we have a lot of clients asking that they want more integrating with nature. When they're in the living room, they want to see the pool, they want to see the grass, and so forth. But the reality of the situation is, as you can see in some of our traditional housing typologies, these courtyard houses actually, they mostly consist of trees, but they don't have a lot of ground cover. They don't have grass, And the reason for that is that it's always surrounded by almost like a desert themed landscaping, which is basically sand patches. and on the other hand, us as local living our lives nowadays as contemporary lifestyles, we always like to see the grass green. So we're getting this dichotomy between getting rid of the natural grass to make way for the plastic carpet grass, which looks almost like the normal grass. So, speaking about this, what are your thoughts about this? Because to be honest with you, it is a prevalent trend that is happening. So, is there any to just to build on about this contradiction between passive design versus open space design versus natural versus artificial grass? So, what is your opinions about this, and if there is any certain direction that you think we should be going in? Like, is it necessarily even necessary to have every patch of land in your household to be covered in grass, or not necessarily, or have it in clustered zones where it can be used more efficiently as to produce foods and so forth? So I'd like to pick your brains a bit about this topic because it is very important, to be honest with you.
Yeah, Ahmed, I would say that in some senses you could say that these large grass areas is kind of a high energy landscape, right? Because it's requiring a lot of irrigation, a lot of maintenance, and again, it's if it's left for a few years, it will deteriorate. If it's unirrigated, it will deteriorate. So, you know, that's in a way what I'm saying is I would much more advocate the use of much more careful planting selection, planting that integrating. I mean, I'm not saying I wouldn't advocate only local plants, but you can have a diversity, but carefully chosen to facilitate kind of like biodiversity, and a minimal use of irrigation water to get a maximum amount of biodiversity rather than the other way around, which is, I think, the tendency: maximum amount of irrigation and a minimal amount of biodiversity, which is unfortunate. It kind of looks beautiful and it has a certain image that resonates in the imagination, but again, it's very energy intensive.
Will, do you have anything to add?
I think if you're talking about the community element that was so important last year, I think it could be providing a green space, because I think one of the reasons why it's so important for families here is they want children to have somewhere to play, or that grass element, somewhere to run around on. So it could be that, if you've got 20 houses that are sharing one green space, that's very different than every apartment or every villa having a green space, and that communal space can be designed to reduce that, minimizing on a community scale. Because I think we shouldn't take away what people feel that they need as well. It's how do we integrate it in a more sustainable way. I think the other thing we can maybe learn from is Japanese gardens, because they use a lot of dry materials, but in a very beautiful way. And it's not necessarily you see covered in grass, but lawned sand or manicured sand is actually a very beautiful thing. It's just how do we integrate this into a designed way. And there's some great examples in Portugal, I think, where they're even bringing the sand into the inside of the buildings to become, it's almost like a luxury to have this relationship with sand. I think but as long as it's not, messing with your technology in the house, there's a side to it that how do we use it in different ways.
Yeah. That's something I noticed last year as well. If you remember, we had a lot of submissions which dealt with a modular expansion of the household. So it talked about how you start out with being a couple, and the couple expands into a bigger family, and how you can, they kind of talk to one another in terms of the open space versus built space. So I wanted also to ask you a question about your thoughts about modular phasing of individual villas, because our families and our traits as Emiratis, they expand, and also very quickly. So when you go from a couple to becoming a family to becoming an expanded family where sons and children, or the wives, the daughters and the sons, they marry, and there are now actually recently released regulations in the Emirate of Dubai where they're promoting flexibility in terms of setbacks, where they allow the sons blocks that are going to be constructed connect with the main villas and reduce setbacks. So traditionally we had 3 meters, now they're allowing for 1.5 meters. And how that all falls within an existing urban context. So let's say, for example, you have this new typology which has been, let's say, selected as a shortlist. How will that fit into the general urban context of your stereotypical individual villa, which has 3 meter setback on all sides? So, in summary, what I'm trying to say is, how does the new typology footprint affect the existing urban context? And how does modularity assist in us to review these submissions in terms of creating a house for the future, both in terms of requirements and both in terms of adaptability? I'm sorry, I know it's a big question, but I think we have enough time to delve into that.
Yeah, I think just leaning back to the experience in the UK, I think what was turned quite interesting is the Muse house against the main house, and this typology of having smaller next to larger units and how they sit together. It may have maybe be designed for something else back then, but how they've been adaptive. I think the importance is the adaptive space and the modularity of how these spaces can evolve. As you say, you don't know, maybe you have 2 children or 5 children, but how they can sit within a community, and I think that could be one way of exploring it, and also not being too fixed on a layout of what a house is now and what it could be in the future. I think that's, how do we use space? We don't have to use space like we used 100 years ago. Spaces can adapt, and how we use houses can adapt as well. So I think that's something to explore.
Charles, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, it's unfortunate, the setbacks and the regulations in Dubai. I think when we spoke last year, we talked a little bit about the Georgian Terrace house in the UK and the use of party walls. And you're also such a scholar on the traditional Islamic city and the courtyards and the network of streets. And I just feel it's a shame that the planning or zoning regulations have kind of ruled out the possibility of party walls, which I think could be, something that could be of great value in UAE in future.
Party walls meaning zero setback? Do you mean zero
setback? Yeah, like two buildings adjacent, sharing a common wall, which may seem undesirable in the current market, but in London it's just a fact of life. Like everybody lives in a terrace house, or occasionally semi-detached, but a fully detached villa in a home in central London is extremely rare. So but those shared walls, it's one less outer surface to the building, so they help to control heat. Of course, traditionally they had the chimneys were built into those walls, so the heat that your neighbor generated was also shared. And I would love to see a future planning guideline that would permit that. But I think we have to work within the regulations as they exist now. So there's a new opportunity for a closer adjacency if it's a family member. Is that what you were describing earlier?
Yes. Those are recently newly added regulations to the current regulation framework.
But it's only a reduction of the setback, not an elimination of it.
Yes, but I mean, there are developments which look at zero setbacks, but those are in controlled environments and not widespread within the city. So it is happening one step at a time. And as you said, it really is thought-provoking, because the way that we review these submissions has to cater to adaptability and being applicable. So it's very interesting conversation, I think. So
Yeah.
I think that's for another time.
Yeah. Understood.
Since time is limited, we will wrap up with one final question, which is if you both have any examples of projects which you have basically developed or designed and completed from around the world that you believe is representative of the topics that we are discussing now, it would be good to share them, of course, in a very brief summary. And what are the lessons learned from that? So, a project and lessons learned and relevant to the area, or lessons that are relevant to the Emirate of Dubai.
Shall I go first, or Charles?
Okay, well, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of projects rather than just one specific one. I think it's really worth investigating is the forestry project in Thailand, which is a residential mixed use, but the use of planting, the layouts are very interesting. It's also a huge focus on this community element, so elderly families living closer to younger generations. And this, I think there's one thing is this aspirational living as well. So you're starting off as a young Emirati family wanting to move into a bigger family, for example. This is something very interesting. I think the all of the expo projects we've worked on are things to learn of. So the UAE pavilion we did for Milan, which was this amazing kind of space that had a lot of references to Emirati life and culture. Could be a one to look at. And recently in Japan, the Saudi pavilion, there's a lot of learnings from resilience within that project. I won't delve too much into it because I haven't worked on it personally, but I think it's worth exploring and looking at some of the contextualization of that and some of the learnings. I think it's very adaptive. So there's a lot of information coming back, and we're learning from that building as well. So I think that's something that's interesting. And then, of course, Mazda, which I think hopefully when Charles is here and have a week can go and walk through and see how that is still informing us now. So, yeah, those are my thoughts.
Okay, I mean, I think for me, I've got to. I mean, you probably know it well, but I've got to mention the BIA headquarters, which I think that kind of resonates for us, not only because of it being a LEED platinum building in terms of energy use and kind of a demonstrator of best practice in terms of like control systems and so forth, but also like the dune forms, which are kind of resolutely modern, but also come from the place itself. And of course, the building's sited very, very near on the edge of the desert in Sharjah. So kind of I think that the idea of formal invention and the kind of relationship to the landscape, like sitting deeply within the landscape, where that building's positioned on the edge of the open desert. I think there are good lessons to be learned from this experience.
Thank you. So that leads me to the final question, which is the obvious one, which is any last advice for the people who are submitting for the House of the Future competition, the second edition. So if you have any last thoughts or share any feedback into what things you are looking for, what things you are looking for it to stand out, in which successful review by us and hopefully make it into the shortlist. So if you have any advice.
Yeah, I think last year's submissions were such a high standard. I think definitely look back at what the learnings from those were, but also I think the process and how how the designs came about was what we really found intriguing, because it's very difficult to see final polished images, but how did they get to that idea? And I think some of the best ones were simple hand sketches or diagrams to get to why that form has come by that. I think, as Charles mentioned, learning from projects, learning from the landscape that is very contextualized to here is really, really important. So I think those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier, Will, that for me, a lot of it's essential. A lot of course, there's a lot of architects in practice who will submit, and a lot of younger architects are at the beginning of their careers. It's essential with the house that the planning has to be thought through from this standpoint of the people who will live there. You know, that's its purpose. And that was one of my main focuses last year, is the actual planning of the space, and that it's appropriate to the brief and to the user, who is a young Emirati family. And the other thing I would say is also just to touch take an important and self-critical view of the scale. It's a house, yeah. And what I think the purpose of the competition, House of the Future, is to find innovation in housing. So it's not a museum. It's not a cultural building. It's a home for someone to live in, and I think that's quite a good perspective as a designer to from which to begin. I mean, I'm thinking of like the Frank Lloyd Wright homes, the amount of beautiful, incredible invention and experimentation that can take place, but always within the scale of domestic architecture. I think that's the key, to remain within the scale of domestic architecture. That would be my advice.
Thank you. Finally, I would like to remind everyone that there are prizes up to 1 million dirhams for the competition. There are prizes as well from the first and third place winners as well. And the registration deadline is April the 30th. And finally, we would like to thank Will Plowman, Charles Walker for their precious time and for their honest feedback that they have shared with us. And especially the Mohammed bin Rashid Centre for Government Innovation that have made this panel session possible, in which both Emiratis and international consultants can share their ideas for the public and hopefully inspire new architects to innovate, and as well as the general people that are very into the competition and are willing to participate as well, wishing them the best of luck. So thank you all. Thank you for your time. And thank you, Will and Charles, for your time as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very welcome, and thank you, Ahmed. Well, nice to see you guys.
Yeah, nice. And good luck. Good luck. We're looking forward to it.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I'm very excited to see what we have, what they have in store for us. So thank you, everybody, and looking forward to seeing you while reviewing your drawings. So all the best to everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.